Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here at the Center for Global Security Research for today's lecture. My name is Asmar Askedom, and I'm the Associate Deputy Director of the Center. Our speaker today is Dr. Paul Scharre. He is the Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for a New American Security in Washington, D.C. Dr. Scharre has a long career working on defense issues in various positions. He's held leading roles in establishing policies on emerging technologies in the U.S. Department of Defense and also within the Office of the Secretary of Defense, OSD. Before that, he was a U.S. Army Ranger serving both in Iraq and Afghanistan. So Dr. Scharre recently published a book called For Battlegrounds, Power in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, and his lecture today is about that book. Dr. Scharre's book explores the ways in which AI is already being used, especially in China, and what this means for the balance of power among AI superpowers, China, the US, and Europe. So Dr. Scharre will talk for about 45 minutes, and during that time, he'll provide us a deep dive into his book. Then we'll turn to the audience for questions, so feel free to start raising your hands electronically, or you can start typing in your questions into the chat during the lecture, and I'll get to them afterward. Dr. Scharre also already copied and pasted a link to his book into the chat, so you guys can have access to where you can purchase that. So with that said, Dr. Scharre, thanks so much for accepting our invitation and coming to discuss your book. I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Well, thank you. Thanks for that very kind introduction. And thank you for having me. And thank you, everyone, for joining this discussion. Like so many of us, I imagine that you all are thinking very deeply about the changes that we're seeing in our world, the very astonishing progress underway in artificial intelligence, and trying to figure out how do we best anticipate the challenges that are ahead. So with that in mind, I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk with all of you about how artificial intelligence is changing global power. China's leader Xi Jinping has said science and technology has become the main battleground of global power rivalry. Is the United States ready for that competition? 200 years ago, we saw during the Industrial Revolution that nations rose and fell on the global stage based on how rapidly they industrialized. At the start of the Industrial Revolution, Russia led Europe in economic power by virtue of its vast size. Yet Great Britain and Germany industrialized faster while Russia fell behind. And by the turn of the 20th century, Great Britain and Germany had eclipsed Russia in economic power and, by extension, military power. Artificial intelligence has a similar potential to change the global balance of power today. We want to believe that we're Great Britain or Germany, but deep down, our fear is that we might be Russia, and China might be on track to overtake the United States. I'm going to tell you a story that on the surface sounds like we're Russia. It's about facial recognition and how China is ahead of the US in facial recognition deployment. China has half of the world's 1 billion surveillance cameras, and they increasingly use AI tools like facial recognition and gait recognition to identify and track individuals. The Chinese Communist Party is building a massive domestic surveillance system, and these investments not only fund Chinese AI companies, but even more important, they give Chinese companies data on which to train their algorithms. And by using their facial recognition systems in the real world, Chinese companies get to improve their algorithms with feedback on how they're performing. Meanwhile, in the United States, it seems like we're totally behind. Facial recognition deployment has stalled out in the United States. There's been a grassroots movement of cities and states banning facial recognition by law enforcement. IBM, Amazon, and Microsoft have all said that they won't sell their facial recognition software to law enforcement. On the surface, it seems like maybe we're Russia, that China is racing ahead while we're left behind. On the surface, it can sometimes seem like China is poised to win the AI revolution. But what we may not realize is that the winner of the AI revolution won't be who has the best technology, but who finds the best ways of using it. And that means using it in every aspect of society, for economic productivity, for social welfare, and for military applications. So yes, Chinese companies will have more data on Chinese faces, but that won't help them train AI fighter pilots, for example. What is going to train AI fighter pilots is not facial recognition. It's actually military and civilian scientists working together to find the best ways of using AI for military advantage. Now, we worry that having an open society can slow us down. China's deployed 500 million cameras while we're still debating the issue. Well, the Chinese Communist Party can simply dictate how Chinese society will adopt a new technology. Meanwhile, here in the United States, there's a messy give and take among local, state, and federal authorities, the private sector, civil society, and ordinary citizens about how we're going to use technologies. But that actually is a strength, because what matters most is finding the best ways of using technology. The United States has fundamental strengths in the AI competition that China cannot match. Our open society is a magnet for global talent, and our network of allies dominate the AI hardware ecosystem. But we have to harness those strengths. My book, Battlegrounds: Power in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, outlines what it will take for the United States to win the AI revolution and remain a global leader in artificial intelligence. It's going to require being strategic. We don't need to do everything. We just need to do a few key things right to stay ahead. What I do in the book and what I want to do with you today is talk about what actually matters in this competition and outline how the United States can win. To focus on what matters, we need to understand how artificial intelligence is changing global power. So let's go back to the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution not only saw nations rise and fall on the global stage, but also saw the key metrics of power change. Coal and steel became key inputs of national power. Oil became a geostrategic resource that nations were willing to fight wars over. So what is the new oil today? To use a term that sometimes gets thrown around. I want to argue that data, computing hardware, human talent, and institutions are the four key battlegrounds of geopolitical competition in artificial intelligence. The first two, data and computing hardware, are technical inputs into AI. The artificial intelligence revolution is being driven by dramatic progress in machine learning, in which algorithms are trained on data. So data, algorithms, and computing hardware that's used to do this training are the three technical resources that are needed for machine learning. But it's difficult to control the spread of the algorithms. The AI research community is very open, and new breakthroughs are published online and spread very rapidly. So any competitive advantage is likely to come from data or computing hardware. The second two battlegrounds of AI competition are the social software that enables artificial intelligence in real-world applications, human talent, and institutions, the organizations that shape AI adoption. Whichever companies and countries lead in these four areas will lead an AI-driven future. So let's talk about data. Data is an essential resource for machine learning. You may have heard data is the new oil. A few years ago, there was a raft of articles proclaiming data is the new oil, and then not long after, a whole series of articles saying, well, data is not the new oil. Like any analogy, it has some benefits, but it can be misleading in some ways. So data, like oil, is a valuable resource. It can be collected, pooled, refined. You can think of data as the fuel for the engine of machine learning. Machine learning algorithms are trained on data. And in fact, cutting-edge machine learning models use massive amounts of data. Image recognition models use millions of labeled images. Large language models like ChatGPT are trained on hundreds of gigabytes of text, a good chunk of the text on the internet. So does China have a data advantage? Well, claims that China is the Saudi Arabia of data don't really match reality. Now, in theory, China's alleged authoritarian advantage in data comes from two factors. One is its larger population, which enables the collection of more data. More people online means there's going to be more data. And two, a data governance that includes massive government surveillance. The government is surveilling its citizens and collecting large amounts of data on its citizens through those means. Now, both of these things are true, but they don't necessarily add up to a data advantage. So why is that? Well, for one, it turns out that a country's population matters far less than the user base of technology companies. And US tech companies have global reach. They're not constrained by the US population. Facebook and YouTube have over 2 billion users each. WeChat, by comparison, a Chinese social media app, has only 1.2 billion users. In fact, except for TikTok, Chinese companies have struggled to succeed outside of China and to gain a global foothold. So while the Chinese Communist Party has built a massive surveillance system for monitoring its citizens, that does not always translate into greater access to data for Chinese companies. In some areas like facial recognition, Chinese companies are likely to have an edge over US firms. many US companies aren't investing in facial recognition or deploying it on the same scale that Chinese firms are in large ways. But as you see in this story I told at the beginning here, that doesn't necessarily translate into an advantage in AI overall. And one of the key reasons why is because data, unlike oil, is not a fungible asset. So Chinese companies may be well positioned to estimate the online spending habits of Chinese consumers, but those algorithms may not hold up in other markets, and they certainly won't be useful for training AI fighter pilots. It's also true that while there are no restrictions in China on government spying, that isn't the case for companies. In fact, we've seen more recently the Chinese government has passed consumer data privacy regulations, cracking down on what private companies can do. Now, partly this in response is to a whole spate of privacy scandals inside China, where companies have been abusing user data. And the Chinese Communist Party does care about social governance. But it's also because the Chinese Communist Party doesn't want anyone else to have the same spying powers that it has. And this is part of a broader crackdown that we've seen on the tech sector in China. So both the United States and China have access to ample amounts of data. What's going to matter more is how they use it. The real data advantage will be those who are successful in building a pipeline for collecting and refining data so that it's ready to be used for machine learning. Time and again, when I spoke with AI engineers when I was researching the book, they told me how the hard part was the data. It was getting access to the data, cleaning it up, getting it ready to train an algorithm. That took maybe 6 or 9 months. And then once the data was ready to go, they could actually train an algorithm in 2 weeks for lots of very useful applications. Data is essential, and the organizations that will have a data advantage are those that can successfully harness data for machine learning. Now, right now, in the U.S. Defense Department, we have a lot of unnecessary obstacles in the way of getting the data that we need. When I spoke with researchers at the Joint AI Center, they told me about all of the problems that they had faced in getting access to data. And in one case, it just blew my mind. They actually had to transfer data from one unclassified network to another unclassified network. But, and I'm sure anyone working in government can appreciate this, the DoD policies wouldn't allow them to do this. They couldn't connect one unclassified network to another unclassified network. So what they ended up doing was they downloaded the data onto hard drives and just mailed it. And that was apparently acceptable under DoD policies. So the Defense Department needs to reform its policies to make data more accessible. If we're going to use data, if we're going to be even just competitive in this area, we've got to do a better job of finding ways to make data more accessible and use the data that we have and trying to strip out some of this red tape that can get in the way of turning data to useful purposes. But even if the US military does everything right, the best that we can hope for is probably a dead even race in data, because China's also going to have access to data, and they're also going to be moving quickly to refine and use the data that they have. So any US advantage in this competition won't come from data. Now, machine learning models are trained on data using hardware in the form of computer chips. So let's talk about the hardware dimension of this competition, the second battleground of AI competition. If data is overrated, hardware is usually underrated as an element of strategic competition. The most cutting-edge machine learning models use massive amounts of data and massive amounts of hardware. Large language models like ChatGPT or its newest successor, GPT-4, are trained on thousands of specialized computer chips, graphics processing units or GPUs, running for weeks or months at a time. The amount of computing hardware that's used in the most cutting-edge machine learning research projects has increased, it just blows me away, 10 billion-fold since 2010. It's doubling every 6 months. For the largest models, that's a doubling every 10 months. So that's a really impressive rate of growth. That's much faster than the rate of growth that we saw under Moore's law in computing hardware doubling every 24 months. And I can't think of any other technology area where we're seeing such rapid rates of growth. That means we're likely to see in the future ever more capable AI systems as the amount of computing hardware that's being thrown at training these systems continues to grow exponentially. Computing hardware, or sometimes in the field it's just called compute, is becoming an even more vital research for machine learning. And we are headed into an era of compute-intensive machine learning, where the largest and most capable models, like ChatGPT or GPT-4, use massive amounts of compute for training. This means that we're quickly transitioning to an era where compute is a strategic resource that will determine who has access to the most advanced AI capabilities. So we're used to thinking of semiconductors as a foundational technology, one that empowers all of these digital devices that we have: cars, computers, Internet of Things devices, our phones. But the trends in machine learning suggest something different. They suggest that semiconductors for the most cutting-edge chips are poised to be something more like a strategic global asset, like access to enriched uranium is, something that divides the world into haves and have-nots. And what makes compute so valuable as a point of strategic competition is that it is a physical resource that we can restrict others from using. So unlike algorithms that spread very easily, chips have to be somewhere. And if we can control the points of production of these most advanced chips, then you can control who has access to them, and by extension, who has access to the most powerful AI systems. And in fact, the US government is already doing this. Semiconductor manufacturing can be controlled at key choke points in the global supply chain. So who controls this vital strategic resource? Now, the seemingly bad news here is that none of these leading edge chips are made here in the United States. 90% of the leading edge manufacturing occurs in Taiwan, an island 100 miles off the coast of China that the Chinese Communist Party has pledged to absorb by force if necessary. So none of that seems very good for the United States. But the important insight here is that the US doesn't need to control everything. It just needs to control some key choke points in the supply chain. And that's where the United States is dominant. US companies dominate key choke points in the equipment and the software that's used to manufacture these leading edge chips. And in fact, all of the most advanced chips in the world depend on US equipment. And the United States has weaponized this control to shut China out of the most advanced AI chips. In October of last year, the Biden administration released sweeping new export controls on semiconductor technology to China. Now, these include controls on the equipment that is used to manufacture chips and on the high-end chips themselves. So at the same time, the US is restricting access to the chips to China and China's ability to make their own advanced chips. So even though these chips aren't made in the US told Taiwan and South Korea, which also has advanced fabs, that it can't ship any advanced chips beyond a certain threshold to China that are made using US technology. So even if these chips are designed in China, made in Taiwan or South Korea, and then shipped back to China, the US said, you can't make these chips because the equipment uses US technology to manufacture these chips. And this effectively locks China out of access to these most advanced chips and, by extension, the most advanced AI capabilities. And US restrictions on the manufacturing equipment to China also holds back China's own domestic chip production. But the US is going to have to get its allies on board for these export controls to work. 3 countries, the United States, Japan, and the Netherlands, control 90% of the world's manufacturing equipment for semiconductors. So if Japan and the Netherlands join the US in enacting very strict controls on the most advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China, China will be effectively shut out of this leading edge manufacturing. And China's going to have a very steep hill to climb to build a fully indigenous supply chain for this manufacturing equipment, which is very advanced, very difficult to produce. But Japan and the Netherlands need to join US controls for this to work. The US is not a unipolar technology power. Now, news reports that we've seen trickling out over the last couple months suggest that the 3 countries have reached a deal for Japan and the Netherlands to join US controls. But the details remain sketchy here, and the details matter quite a bit in terms of what actually is going to be restricted by Japan and the Netherlands. So it remains to be seen just how effective these controls are going to be. But if the US is able to keep allies on board, then the US is going to have a major lead over China in AI hardware, and China's going to struggle to keep up. This points to a core insight in this competition, which is that America's alliances are a very important strength that China cannot compete with. And if we work with allies, the US will have a tremendous advantage over China. The US has a global network of alliances that China does not have, and that are a major strength in this competition. Now, the US is also going to have to invest in its own competitiveness at home. So as we see the amount of computing hardware that's used for training these frontier models going up, the costs for doing so are also rising. The amount of computing hardware that's being used to train these models is growing much faster than the rate of improvement in the hardware alone. And big tech companies like OpenAI, Google, and Microsoft are throwing down tremendous amounts of money to compete in this space and build ever larger, ever more capable AI models. The most advanced models today, like ChatGPT, cost at least in the tens of millions of dollars to train for their final training run. And in fact, Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, has said that training GPT-4 cost in total over $100 million. Now, not surprisingly, these rising costs in computing hardware are locking others out of the marketplace of training these most advanced models. This is really a problem for academia, in particular in the United States, because they don't have the funds to compete to train these very large models. And we've seen in the US a culture in the AI community of open sourcing models, of releasing them publicly. But as models have become more capable and more expensive, tech companies are, not surprisingly, withholding releasing their most advanced models. Now, it's really important that the US harnesses the brainpower that we have in academia, and we don't want US academics studying AI to be shut out of using these most capable systems. The US government has explored creating a national AI research resource that would give academics greater computing resources. This is a really important move and one that could enhance US competitiveness. To do that, Congress needs to fund the National AI Research Resource to give these computing resources to academics so they can continue to compete as we see AI transition to a more compute-intensive regime. Finally, the US government is going to need to invest in US semiconductor companies to ensure they stay dominant in these key choke points in the supply chain. Last year, Congress approved $52 billion in subsidies for the semiconductor industry as part of the broader $280 billion CHIPS and Science Act. This is a major investment in American science and one that's going to be essential for competing with China. And investing in the US semiconductor industry is going to be important to keep US leadership in AI hardware. But the US needs a strategy to spend this money effectively. And again, we don't need to do everything. We need to find some key areas in semiconductors that are essential to compete. So the goal here shouldn't be to reshore all semiconductor manufacturing to the United States or even all leading edge manufacturing. That's not possible. It's not viable. That shouldn't be the US goal. What the US needs to do is to build a critical mass of leading edge manufacturing in the United States. So there's a healthy ecosystem of companies and of hardware talent in the United States. Diversifying supply chains from Taiwan is important, not to try to move all leading edge manufacturing out of Taiwan, but to create a little more diversity in the supply chain so we don't see so much of a concentration in an area that's such a geopolitical flashpoint. But the most important thing is keeping US companies dominant in these critical choke points for the next generation of chips, so the US can maintain its strategic advantage over China in AI hardware, and the US has the ability, through tools like export controls, to deny actors like China the access to this kind of leading edge AI hardware into the future. Now, people are needed to take these raw inputs of data and computing hardware and turn them into useful AI tools. So let's talk about the third battleground, talent. There's a fierce competition for global talent in AI. Freshly minted graduates from AI PhD programs are commanding professional sports level salaries from top AI labs. And globally, there's a fierce competition among countries as well. China produces more of the top AI scientists in the world than any other country. But here's the thing. Those top Chinese scientists stay in China. They come to the United States. Over half of China's top undergraduates studying artificial intelligence come to the United States for their graduate studies. And then they stay here in the US. 90% of Chinese undergraduates who come to the US to do their PhD in computer science stay in the US after graduation. More broadly, the US is the destination of choice for AI scientists from around the world. US universities and companies are a magnet for global talent. Yes, now there are problems with intellectual property theft and academic espionage. China has an estimated over 200 talent recruitment plans to bring overseas scientific knowledge back to China. China's 1,000 Talents plan is just the most well known of many of these different programs. The US government's been stepping up its protection of intellectual property and academic integrity to ensure that academia and businesses are competing on a level playing field. But just as the US does this, we shouldn't go too far and cut off the flow of talent from China, because the US benefits disproportionately from these talent flows. So even while the US is competing with China, and there are going to be some areas where we need to protect research security, for example, and cut off engagements for uses like military use in China or human rights abuses. We also don't want to pursue a strategy of pure decoupling from China. That's not the answer that's going to be in US interests. So where we've seen instances of US companies and universities working with Chinese entities engaged in human rights abuses or working with the Chinese military, that's a problem. And we need stricter export controls on end use and end user controls to sever those problematic ties. US companies and universities should not be enabling human rights abuses or the Chinese military. But even as we put guardrails around US China AI research ties, we want to sustain linkages that benefit the United States. Even while we're competing with China, the US needs to be working with China on technology so we can stay competitive. More broadly, the United States should make it easier for AI scientists from around the world to come to the United States to study and to start a business. The biggest barrier to this today is US immigration policies. This is an unfortunate case of government regulation hampering innovation. The US National Security Commission on AI argued that immigration reform is a national security imperative. And that's absolutely critical in this competition with China. As a nation of 330 million people, the US is always going to be at a disadvantage in competing against a nation of 1.4 billion if the US restricts itself to homegrown talent. But if the United States can draw on the best and brightest from the world's 8 billion people, then the US will have an advantage in AI talent that China cannot match. America's open society is an advantage in the global competition for AI talent. So if you have the data and the computing hardware and the talent, and you want to take these things and turn them into useful AI applications, you need institutions that can do this. And that's the fourth battleground. Both the US and Chinese militaries are working to import AI technology from the commercial sector, where it's being developed, into military applications. Both militaries are working to innovate faster to make this happen. The US Defense Department has been on an organization building spree over the last several years, creating new organizations like the Defense Innovation Unit, or DIU, the DoD's outpost in Silicon Valley. Well, China's doing the same. So following the US lead, China created their own version of DIU, a rapid response small group in Shenzhen, a commercial hub inside China in their tech sector, to bring commercial technology into the Chinese military. And in fact, Chinese commentators referred to it as China's DIU. So even while the US is innovating, China is doing the same. The real competition here is going to be finding the best ways of using AI. It's not enough to bring the technology into the militaries. We need to make sure that we're at the forefront of finding how do we use this effectively. And history shows that this can be a challenge for new technologies. So for example, airplanes were invented in the United States in the early 20th century. But by the time World War II began, they gave the US no meaningful advantage in air power. All of the great powers at the time had access to airplane technology. What mattered most was figuring out, what do you do with an airplane? How do you use airplanes most effectively as an instrument of military power? Now, the US Navy experimented with airplanes as a component of naval warfare during a series of war games in the period between World War I and World War II. And doing this, the Navy saw the value of airplanes and aircraft carriers and began to develop them. Now, Great Britain was actually the first to develop aircraft carriers. They had an early lead in carrier aviation, but because of internal bureaucratic and cultural squabbles within the British military, they didn't sufficiently invest in aircraft carriers, and they fell behind. It wasn't because Great Britain didn't have access to the technology. They had airplane technology. The problem was that their institutions failed to adapt to harness this new technology. Institutions are going to be a critical component of finding the best ways of using AI and staying ahead of China. And America's open society is a strength here again. So I want to tell you another story that, again, on the surface, sounds like maybe the US is at a disadvantage, but actually it shows the opposite. A few years ago, Google caused a controversy when they discontinued the work on the US military's Project Maven. a project to use AI to help process images and drone video feeds. Now, after Google discontinued work on this project, U.S. national security leaders panicked that they would be shut out of a game-changing new technology that was coming out of the commercial sector. We also saw employees at Google, Amazon, and Microsoft all write open letters protesting working with the U.S. military. Now, needless to say, employees at Chinese tech companies are not going to write open letters protesting working with the government. They'd be thrown in jail if they did that. But the DoD responded to concerns from the tech community about militarizing AI. The DoD convened experts from academia, industry, and civil society to talk about how to use AI for military purposes in ways that are safe, lawful, and ethical. And the result was a set of AI ethics principles guiding AI development inside the U.S. military. And there's been a whole host of efforts following that about implementing responsible AI inside the military. And because the U.S. went through that hard process, we're now in a much better position to be able to work with experts from academia and industry and make the case for the fact that the U.S. is going to use AI in ways that are ethical and responsible and safe in military applications. And that makes it easier for defense-oriented AI startups to bring in top-tier talent and then use that to work with the U.S. military. And in fact, we've seen since then major tech companies working with the U.S. military, including Google. And that's going to be key when we ensure that the U.S. is going to be in a leadership position globally, helping to shape global norms on responsible AI. We saw earlier this year, very recently, the State Department released a political declaration on U.S. views and best practices for responsible military AI. So the U.S. is not just working to shape how it's going to use military AI, but also taking now a leadership position globally. Because these debates inside the U.S. has forced us to grapple with these difficult questions about how to use AI in the military context and come up with answers. So this is a great example of how the diversity of views in the United States and our open society can make us stronger and can lead to better outcomes and better ways of using AI. Now, the U.S. military still has many challenges in AI adoption. I don't want to imply that it's all been smooth sailing from there. But it turns out the fears that tech companies wouldn't work with the U.S. military haven't come to fruition. In fact, there's been a whole raft of new defense-oriented AI startups eager to work with the military. The biggest problem that the U.S. Defense Department has is its own acquisition system, which one executive described to me as lethal to innovation. So when DoD experts talk about lethality, that's not the kind of lethality that we're looking for. And what we see is that bureaucratic red tape gets in the way of DoD moving at the speed of innovation. You can't procure AI the way that we procure aircraft carriers. The DoD needs to be willing to reform its acquisition system to move faster and to take risks. And institutional reform is imperative if the U.S. is going to stay ahead of China. Now, I want to close with a story that shows what all of this can look like when these elements of data, computing hardware, talent, and institutions can come together to find the best ways of using AI. Back in 2019, DARPA, the Pentagon's Department of Mad Scientists, started the Air Combat Evolution, or ACE program, to train an AI fighter pilot. One of their first efforts was the Alpha Dogfight Challenge, taking a page from other efforts in AI space like AlphaGo. Companies submitted their AI agents to compete in simulated aerial combat against one another. And then the winning competitor got to go head-to-head against a human pilot. Now, the winner was Heron Systems, a company nobody'd ever heard of. They beat defense giant Lockheed Martin in the finals. And then they went head-to-head against an experienced Air Force fighter pilot. And the AI absolutely crushed the human pilot, 15-0. The human pilot didn't get a single shot on the AI fighter pilot. Even more amazing, the AI pilot won using a tactic that's basically impossible for humans to do, taking head-to-head gunshots when the aircraft are racing at each other at hundreds of miles per hour, and there's a split second to get a shot off. This is basically impossible for humans, and in fact, it's banned in training because it's dangerous for humans to even try this. When the aircraft are racing at each other head-to-head, they might risk having a collision. But it's not a problem for the AI. The AI can both aim with superhuman precision and avoid a collision at the same time. And even more wild, it learned this tactic entirely on its own. This wasn't programmed into the AI system. It just learned to do this as it was training. So how did Heron Systems accomplish this? Well, they built a competitive league of 100 AI agents flying against each other in simulations. So that built the data they need by running these simulations that could create synthetic data, AI generated data, to then train AI systems. The winning agent had over 30 years of flight time in these simulators. So that gave them the data to train their algorithm. They built the computing infrastructure that they needed to run these simulations nonstop. In fact, when I visited their offices, I could hear roaring in the background their computer servers churning away in their server closet 24/7, running these simulations of aerial combat. They also harnessed their talent. So one of the company policies was Fun Fridays, in which programmers could work on their own pet projects for 1 day a week, which is a huge investment, 20% of the company's time. One of their programmers was very interested in reinforcement learning, a technique that at the time was showing really huge breakthroughs in AI research. And the researcher built a Doom bot to play the computer game Doom using this technique of reinforcement learning. And so when they would pitch DARPA on being allowed to compete in the Alpha Dogfight competition, it was actually this Doom bot playing in the background of their pitch deck that piqued the DARPA program manager's interest. Because here was an example of this company actually doing reinforcement learning successfully. And none of this, of course, would have been possible without an organization like DARPA sponsoring the Alpha Dogfight Challenge, being willing to take on a hard problem, creating the space for new startups to compete and win, putting the institutions in place that can harness U.S. innovation. After winning, Heron Systems got bought by Shield AI, one of a whole slew of new defense-oriented AI startups. And they're now a competitor and the next evolution of the ACE program, which in late 2022 conducted real-world flights of AI agents on an F-16 fighter jet. So this isn't just the story of one company. This story tells us what success looks like and how the U.S. can lead in AI by harnessing data, computing hardware, and human talent, and creating the institutions that we need to find the best ways of using AI to preserve national advantage. Scaling up these approaches across the Defense Department and the U.S. overall are going to be the things that we need to do to compete in these 4 battlegrounds and stay ahead of China in these really key areas of AI competition. The U.S. has tremendous strengths in this competition, and if we harness them, the U.S. can remain the global leader in artificial intelligence and lead an AI-driven future. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. That was a great overview of your book. Really appreciated that.